Hello, I'm Donald Robertson, and this is Stoicism, Philosophy is a Way of Life, the podcast. Today's guest is Tim LeBon, cognitive behavioural therapist, that's CBT for short, research director of the Modern Stoicism organisation, and author of Wise Therapy, Philosophy for Counsellors, Teach Yourself Positive Psychology, and more recently, 365 Ways to Be More Stoic. Tim, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm a little bit chilly here in Guildford and a little bit had to be stoical last night because England got knocked out of the World Cup. But apart from that, I'm really excited to be on your show. Thanks for inviting me.
Cool. Well, we're very pleased to have you here. So let's start with a little bit of background. Could you say how you first got into philosophical practice and into Stoicism?
Yeah, so I studied philosophy, PPE actually, at Oxford, and then did some ancient philosophy at London. And so naturally, I ended up in the world of IT because that was the time that Mrs. Thatcher was savaging our education system. But funny enough, I enjoyed that. But then in my late 20s, I had probably what would now be called an early midlife crisis. But that was a good thing because it got me into studying psychology, and that got me into studying counselling. And I trained initially part-time as a psychotherapist and counsellor, and then was kind of a little bit frustrated with that because there wasn't enough philosophy in it, and I really wanted to kind of use philosophy to help people. Fast forward to the 1990s, and a guy called Lou Marinoff came along and said, hey, philosophers can do counselling, something called philosophical counselling. I got very involved in that, which is actually when we first met, Donald, didn't we, back in the late 90s.
I've got a photograph from back then.
That would probably be hilarious.
I'll send you it.
Yeah, and and that's when I wrote the book Wise Therapy, which was all about how philosophy can help the counsellor, but also got lots of practical philosophy ideas like critical thinking, conceptual analysis, decision making, and stuff. But I'm a little bit embarrassed these days to reflect on how little Stoicism there is in it. I mean, there's a little bit of Stoicism in it, but not that much, and that's mainly, I think, because at the time, to be honest, I wasn't that expert in Stoicism. I'd read a bit, but also there was just a lot of misinformation about Stoicism at the time, about it being about the stiff upper lip and being emotionally repressed. And
well, can I just interject there?
Of course.
I think there's another reason, right? Which is that there was a lot of other stuff in the air, such as existentialism. So a lot of people that were into philosophical practice and into psychotherapy that wanted to draw on philosophy were looking to existential philosophy. And I began studying existential philosophy and how it related to psychoanalysis. And it took me a while to figure out there was a completely different tradition of philosophy that seemed strangely more practical. And, I know that you were kind of into existential therapy at one point, and you probably came across existentialism in the philosophical practice and philosophical counselling world, but then you got more into Stoicism.
Yeah, well, actually, it was the other way round. It's that, so when I started training as a counsellor, I looked at what was available that sounded a bit philosophical, and there was something called existential counselling, people like Emmy van Derzen doing it, and Emmy was very good. But I found that it was a little bit, I don't know, existentialism didn't quite do it for me. But I did encounter people like Viktor Frankl there, who, looking back on it, is actually as much of a Stoic, probably more of a Stoic, than he was an existentialist. I was interested in existentialism. I was interested in people like Socrates and Plato and a whole range of philosophical thinkers. And you're right, there's a whole world of philosophy out there. But what got me into Stoicism was I got invited to a seminar in Exeter back in, I think it was 2011, and that's where we met again, wasn't it, Donald?
Yeah.
And it was by someone called Professor Christopher Gill from Exeter, was doing this. I guess it was a project on whether Stoicism could be helpful, and also trying to make Stoicism better known to the general public. And then connecting again with people like yourself and some other people like John Sellers, and I think it was people like Jules Evans as well. It was a very small seminar room, but in that room there just seemed to be something about, hey, let's think about whether Stoicism could be helpful or not. And we had the idea of running Stoic Week. And at the time, I was actually writing my second book on positive psychology. And so I was aware of a very simple research methodology whereby you gave people a whole load of well-being questionnaires. You got them to do something, in our case, some Stoic exercises for a week. You got them to do the well-being questionnaires again, and you got some qualitative feedback as well, and you could work out whether what they'd done was actually helpful or not. And when we got the results, it was a very pleasant surprise to look at. Not only were people saying, hey, this doing just a week of Stoicism really helped, but also to see the quantitative measures and how much in general Stoicism had helped their well-being and to reduce negative emotions, increase their flourishing, etc.
Some people thought this was a crazy idea. To do research on the benefits of studying philosophy just seemed kind of like outrageous to them. I think in the media at the time, there were some classicists and philosophers who wrote newspaper articles kind of frowning on that aspect of it. But in retrospect, it seems like an obvious thing to do.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, there were people who just thought that this was, I don't know, this wasn't how philosophy should be used, or that it wouldn't be helpful. But thinking about it now, I think, well, why wasn't it done earlier? But actually, it's only the internet really that allowed this kind of thing to happen.
And so, could you say a little bit? Well, we're kind of talking about your career and so on. Where are you at now? Like, do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about what your current role is and the type of work you're doing?
Yeah. Well, also quite key was so I trained as a psychotherapist, and initially I was doing that only part-time, but then I bit the bullet and trained as a CBT therapist, and went back to Oxford to do specialist training there. Really loved CBT, particularly the type that was taught there, which was inspired by Aaron T. Beck, and wanted to be a CBT therapist. And this is where luck comes into it, because it just so happened that was the time where the government had started to train therapists and pay therapists under this scheme called IAPT, Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. So having got my specialist CBT training, I was in a good position to get a job in an IAPT service as a CBT therapist. So I think it was back in 2011, I got a part-time job as a CBT therapist in an IAPT service in Hampshire, which is about half an hour away from Guildford, and combine that with private practice. And since then, in a way, I haven't looked back, because I really love working with people in that service, and so the kind of people that present there, they're often referred by their doctors, or they could self-refer, and they've got moderate to mild problems with anxiety and depression in the main, but some of them come from quite deprived areas. Some of them have got quite serious problems, and it's really quite kind of satisfying to see how they can be helped by CBT, and my role's kind of developed. So now I'm a more senior therapist, and I do a lot of supervision and help design the training, and also involved in kind of innovating in the service. So it's quite a tough role working in the NHS, but quite satisfying and meaningful as well, I think.
Can I tell you my supervision dad joke?
Okay.
Someone asked me once how to define supervision. What is supervision? And I said it's like normal vision, only better. So, moving swiftly on from that, so that's the type of work that you're doing at the moment, and you're working with clients with anxiety, with depression, and the NHS. So I wonder, how do you're obviously in a good position to comment on this, how do you see the relationship between Stoicism, the philosophy, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy in general?
Yeah, great question. Well, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, CBT happened partly because its founders, Aaron T. Beck and Albert Ellis, read Epictetus, and in particular, they liked the bit in his handbook, 1.5, people are disturbed not by things, but by the view they take of things.
They really loved that bit.
They loved that bit.
They go on and on about it.
I know. But so there's a plus and a minus here. So the plus is that they really ran with that and developed an evidence-based therapy. And so it's a CBT, modern CBT isn't just that. It's a kind of whole. I mean, what they do is in the NHS anyway is it's kind of diagnosis driven. So someone will come, they'll have a diagnosis, say, of obsessive compulsive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or depression. And then what the psychologists have done is they've developed what are called disorder-specific models, which is a kind of map for what kind of typically people who've got one of those problems, what they do, how they think. And then they've also got like a treatment package, which is designed and also tested to help people overcome that. So it's kind of quite scientific, and it's kind of gone on from the kind of stuff that you find in Epictetus to being something that is kind of sophisticated, and and there's kind of different models and packages for all of the different anxiety disorders, for instance.
Yeah, I think this is an aspect that when people ask this question about how Stoicism relates to CBT, that's the first thing they need to know, because they often don't understand that CBT is to a large extent diagnosis driven. And actually, you could say that CBT is a little bit of a misnomer because it's singular. And in a sense, it should be plural. Like there, in a way, CBT kind of consists of multiple therapies or multiple therapy protocols. It's more than one thing in a sense.
Exactly. I think that's very well put. And it should probably be cognitive behavioral therapies for all of the different things. So there's two things around that as well. So one is that when people are trying to apply Stoicism to their mental health problems, there isn't necessarily the evidence to back up that. So if someone came for OCD, they might benefit from Stoicism, but I'd much rather, it would be much the better thing to do to do the CBT for OCD for them, which involves
you have a kind of professional obligation to do that as well as a CBT practitioner.
You do, and also it's got a very strong behavioural element, which they're. I mean, it's a bit like sometimes people say that they've had CBT, but they've had a kind of very generic CBT where they just do thought records, and that isn't necessarily the most helpful thing when you go into the specific disorders. So I don't think Stoicism's any worse or better than a generic CBT, but it's just kind of all like a word of warning, really, that there are these kind of evidence-based protocols which you need to adapt for the patient or client, but that's what to go for if someone's got one of these mental health disorders.
Well, let me put words into your mouth then. Is it possible that Stoicism could provide a kind of adjunct to some of those CBT protocols, like a philosophical framework that people might use in combination with it in some cases? And also, is it possible that Stoicism would play more of a role with subclinical problems of everyday living, or resilience building outside the consulting room and the treatment and diagnosis, generally diagnosis-driven treatment.
Absolutely. So people don't necessarily get quite as excited about CBT as they do about Stoicism. So,
have you ever met anyone with a CBT tattoo?
Not that I know of. And
I'm still holding out for this. But have you seen all those people with Stoicism tattoos?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so sometimes I think of CBT as being a bit like going to the dentist. Hopefully not quite as painful as that, but you only do it if you're in pain. And then you do as little of it as you can and start leading your life. Whereas Stoicism's, I don't know, it's a bit more like going to a meditation retreat or an interesting lecture. You're kind of enjoying it and you're thinking it can help your life in general, not just when you're in some kind of mental pain. So definitely, I'm very interested in it being a preventative measure. In fact, I'm going to propose a resilience course based on Stoicism at the NHS place where I work. But I also think that Stoicism has got the potential for certain issues that CBT hasn't kind of got round to covering yet. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, anger. So you might think, your listeners might think that anger isn't that a mental health problem. Well, it hasn't been categorized as a disorder in the DSM. Mm-hmm. So there is a CBT for anger, but frankly, what Seneca wrote in On Anger is just as good, if not better.
Yeah.
And so I think that. So in 365 Ways, my new book, there's a whole chapter on anger based largely on what Seneca says. Yeah. And I think it would be a really interesting piece of research to test whether something like that was as good as other treatments for anger or frustration. Yeah. We all get a bit frustrated at times, and can a Stoicism based on Seneca help people be less frustrated? I suspect the answer is yes.
Well, let me add something to that, which is if we were going to build a therapy protocol based on Stoicism, there's more information available surviving about Stoicism for anger than for any other psychological behavioral problem, because we have an entire book by Seneca that's pretty thorough on Stoic psychotherapy for anger, but we also have a load of stuff in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius that specifically addresses the problem of anger. He gives a list of 10 different cognitive strategies in the Meditations specifically for anger. So we've got this kind of embarrassment of riches when it comes to what do the Stoics say about anger. So I think you're right there. And I'll add to something else that you said, which is why haven't psychotherapists said more about anger? And there are several reasons for that, but one of them is by its very nature, people who predominantly experience anger tend to blame other people for their problems and are less likely to self-refer for treatment than people who suffer from anxiety or depression, who tend to be more self-blaming.
Exactly, which is why the way that Seneca begins on anger, which is all of the reasons why anger is a bad thing, are so important, because you'd kind of combine that with a bit of motivational interviewing about trying to, probably what you do in a therapy session is to say, well, there are all these good reasons for being angry, but what is the cost? And there you would draw on all the things that Seneca says. So another hunch I've got is to do with long-term physical conditions people have. So in our NHS service, we get a lot of people with predominantly with they would describe themselves as having a physical problem like fibromyalgia or diabetes. But actually, that brings along with it a lot of mental health problems, including depression and anxiety. And so there's a whole question of how can these people best be helped? because they don't necessarily identify with the mental health problem, and they'd probably get quite angry if you told them, you've got a problem with depression. They would say, no, I haven't. I've got a problem with fibromyalgia.
Yeah.
So my hunch is that a kind of Stoic approach might be helpful for these people, because it's kind of talking about strength, it's talking about resilience, it's talking about courage, it's talking about leading a good life despite the hand that fate might have dealt you, that you can still flourish. So that's the hunch I've got, which I think would be really good to test out.
You're talking about chronic health problems, but also chronic pain as well would be another way of framing it. Mm-hmm. And actually, funnily enough, like anger, as you mentioned, these are often clients who don't want therapy or don't think that therapy would be relevant to them. Even people with chronic back pain, or, often part of their problem is psychological or behavioral as well as physical. So definitely, it's an interesting situation, if you like, that some of the people that might benefit the most from Stoicism in relation to therapy might be the ones that are least likely to self-refer for CBT. That reminds me of another issue with Stoicism, is that the demographic that it appeals to is different, I think, than the demographic that CBT appeals to. There are certain types of people that have an aversion to psychotherapy and counselling. I'm sure you may have noticed this. Mm-hmm. So I've got some experience of working with some of them, and you probably have too. I used to work in high schools with socially excluded kids, and a lot of the young boys that I worked with, who were mainly 15 years old, would have kind of didn't like the idea of going and talking about their feelings to a counsellor, because it seemed kind of, I don't know, it was stigmatized for them, if you like. And whereas Stoicism kind of appealed to them because of its association with toughness. And weirdly, I find the same thing with prison inmates and people who are serving in the military. Like, they often, therapy and counselling have a kind of stigma for them that Stoicism doesn't have. Like, Stoicism in some ways appeals to them. And so because of that, I think it has the potential to reach a wholly different demographic. People that might have never read books on self-help or therapy before get into it because they've read Marcus Aurelius.
I think that's absolutely right. And if I can add two other groups that I think, as well as younger people, perhaps mainly younger men there, the military, people in prisons, I think maybe older people as well sometimes don't like the idea of therapy, or that there's something wrong with them, and might be attracted to Stoicism. And a rather larger group than any of those four would be men.
Men generally.
In Stoic Week, so I've been running Stoic Week the last couple of years with Eve Riches, and also been doing the research on it since Stoic Week started in 2012. And consistently, we found that more men than women do Stoic Week by a proportion of I think it's about 60 to 40 or 65 to 35, it varies. Now, interestingly, women benefit as much as the men. So it's not like Stoicism is just for men at all. No. And we're very interested in more women taking part. But I think what you said is absolutely right, Donald. In general, men are a group who just don't get into psychological help or self-help as much as women, but they need it. Or I think they could benefit from it. So they they're more likely to go down the pub or whatever than to read a self-help book. But I think they're more likely to read a Stoic self-help book or do a Stoic course than they would be some other forms of help.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tim, are you saying that Stoicism is therapy for people that don't like therapy?
I think I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, I think it could be.
I think the way I would put it is, like, we're living in an era where we're buried under mountains of self-help literature. We've never had as much self-help literature. Although people seem crazier than ever, right, if you look online. But although we've got all of this help, there's still a lot of people that don't read any of it and aren't interested in it. And those people will sometimes say they watched the movie Gladiator and then they went out and read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and they found it helped them in life. But that may be the only exposure that they've got to any kind of therapeutic or self-help literature. And those people particularly interest me because they are like, we as therapists, we tend to forget that there's whole chunks of society that have no interest in what we do for a living. Like, they would never crack open a self-help book or read an article about it normally. They're kind of in a bubble, like completely isolated from the world of therapy, as it were. But Stoicism can reach those people.
I hope so. I think that's a really interesting idea. And maybe that'll be one of the takeaways from our conversation today. Stoicism it's therapy for people that don't like therapy.
Yeah. It reaches the parts that other therapies can't reach, or something like that, of society. So the other thing I was going to ask you, actually, that you kind of touched on a little bit, is do you think Stoicism is sticky? So I think the holy grail of mental health research is prevention is better than cure. And this is a baby, like it's in its infancy research, in a sense, on resilience building. And it's been strongly associated with positive psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy. But there may be an argument to say that Stoicism has a unique value in relation to resilience building, because there's something you mentioned earlier about Stoicism that's different from CBT, which is it's a body of literature and a philosophy of life that people treat almost like a Western yoga, like almost like a religion. So could it be that it's longer lasting, like, or that people adhere to it more permanently than they might to training in positive psychology or CBT?
So I haven't got any data on that yet, but I think it would be a really interesting thing to research. And as you say, there's a case for that being true, because I think so. When I finish a course of CBT treatment with someone, we do this thing called the blueprint, which is what have I learned from therapy and what am I going to do to keep it going? Now, as you can imagine, sometimes people re-refer. And so a couple of years later, you might have seen this client and the therapy went really well and they recovered and they come back and you ask them, hey, do you remember in that last session we did that blueprint? How have you used that in the last 2 years? And more often than not, unfortunately, the answer is, oh, yeah, I kind of put that in the attic or something, or the equivalent of that.
Oh, yeah, that piece of paper you gave me.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
I'm going to say something a bit controversial. It seems to me that when CBT practitioners do the blueprint, which is their attempt to maintain therapeutic improvements long term with the client, they give them a plan to take away that they expect them to follow indefinitely, really, or in the longer term.
Exactly.
It's a bit of a Hail Mary. Like, it's a little bit of a, like, let's hope this works. Like, because adherence to those kind of plans is not great long term. Whereas, the way I would put it, a similar observation is that if you give people a self-help book on CBT, if you're lucky, they'll read it. They might get really into it, but it would be unusual that they would keep reading it every year for the rest of their life, right? That would be surprising. But people who get into Stoicism often will say they go back and reread the Meditations or Epictetus every year or every few years. They keep returning to Stoicism indefinitely. And like, in that sense, I think it's stickier than CBT.
And also, for many people, Stoicism will really speak to them. They'll say, yeah, this thing about the dichotomy of control, or this thing about wisdom, that's kind of what I thought all along, but now it's been put in this way that I really understand and can implement, and so that they just kind of make it part of their philosophy of life and get into the habit of doing it.
And it's kind of cooler. in a sense.
Yes.
Like I made this joke about whether they get tattoos of like Albert Ellis or whether like Marcus Aurelius, but the Stoicism people enjoy reading it more. Like the Meditations is a much more profound, moving, enjoyable, memorable text than David Burns's Feeling Good, for example, or like any book on CBT. It's more quotable, more
Yeah.
tweetable, so it's more memorable.
And they'd prefer to have it as part of their identity as well. I'm a Stoic rather than I'm someone who was a patient for CBT.
Well, that's an interesting psychological observation because CBT doesn't delve by its very nature that much into role theory in social psychology, but a very high level of cognitive functioning, if you like. One of the questions is whether people actually identify with a whole cluster of ideas, and do they view themselves? And we don't even really have a name, let alone, for somebody who's popped out the other end of CBT therapy. They don't call themselves a CBTer. It's hard to identify with CBT, but people identify with Stoicism. They call themselves a Stoic. So that high level of cognitive identification with the role kind of is like a glue, like that can bind together all of the behaviors and cognitions, all of the lower level cognitive and behavioral stuff that constitutes the strategies that we want people to keep doing long term. What about third wave CBT, or more broadly? We mentioned earlier that there are actually multiple CBTs in a sense, or people who work in the NHS or CBT practitioners are more likely to think of it that way, is to think I'm really doing a bunch of different therapies. There's a cluster of them, like that are related but distinct. Other flavors of CBT that you think are more like Stoicism than others? Or, what do you think the relationship between Stoicism, for example, and the second versus third wave of cognitive therapy is like?
Yeah, I think you can see similarities between them all, really. And actually, I'm not sure if I've said this before to you or publicly, but I think Stoicism could be another third wave CBT.
Yeah.
I think, although, what I said earlier was I've got some reservations about Stoicism for mental health problems. I think it could be presented as a kind of transdiagnostic CBT, that not for particular problems, but something that can help in general. And so I think that is one way of framing a kind of Stoic therapy. But to answer your question, there's certainly a lot of similarities between Stoicism and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with that, but it's kind of what the people that do ACT say is be aware of your values and just move towards them, and be aware of your thoughts, but don't necessarily get taken in by them. So in other words, move towards your values despite having thoughts to do something different. I mean, there's more to ACT than that, but very crudely, that's what it's saying. And that's kind of a bit like what you do in Stoicism. It's what are your values? Although Stoicism's a bit more directed than that. It says actually the things that are to be valued more than anything are the cardinal virtues, and then move towards these. And so act according to virtue, even if you feel like doing something else. And then with your thoughts, again, we've got Epictetus saying things like you should be like the night watch with your thoughts, and don't necessarily be taken in by them, examine them, and if necessary, disregard them. So you can certainly see some very strong resemblances between ACT and Stoicism, for example.
Like the ACT concept of living in accord with values is so similar to the concept of virtue in ancient philosophy in general that it's surprising they don't refer to it. And the stuff about mindfulness and verbal diffusion or cognitive distancing, I think, is also really similar to some of the major themes in the Stoic literature. Do you think Stoicism could be like a transdiagnostic third wave approach, particularly to resilience building?
Yeah. The other third wave CBT approach that I think is quite similar in some ways to Stoicism, which might surprise some listeners, is compassion-focused therapy. So compassion-focused therapy is the idea that people need to be more compassionate and self-compassionate. And the reason it might surprise people is because sometimes Stoicism is thought of as a very tough philosophy and not all that compassionate. But actually, I think Stoicism is very compassionate and self-compassionate. But the reason that I think there's a very strong similarity is that so people like Paul Gilbert have developed this thing called CFT, compassion-focused therapy. And in that, one of the key techniques is to imagine this ideal compassionate being who has the key virtues of wisdom and strength and caring commitment. And hey, doesn't that sound a bit like the virtues? Doesn't that sound a bit like the ideal Stoic sage or the Stoic role model? So actually in CFT, you get people to imagine this being and kind of what would this person say to you? Imagine yourself being this person. And that sounds to me rather like Stoicism.
I'd go further than that and say that Marcus Aurelius describes one of his Stoic teachers, so the Stoic ideal, as being free from unhealthy passions and yet full of philostorgia or love, like philanthropic or brotherly love. But part of the reason that people don't normally see Stoicism this way is just down to a problem of translation. For the Stoics, we say one of the cardinal virtues is justice, or dikaiosune, but the Greek word encompasses compassion, which the English word justice doesn't really. So one of the main virtues in Stoicism is eugeneia, which means, there are a number of different words they use, but basically it means kindness, or benevolence, or trying to help people, or being friendly towards them. And it kind of encompasses what we mean by compassion. And it's one of the main themes that recurs in particular throughout the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He refers to it a lot, but somehow that kind of gets lost in translation unless you're looking for it. So I think there's a case to be made for kind of presenting Stoicism in a more compassion-focused way.
I agree.
Definitely. So, what about your experience in terms of the research that's been done on Stoicism in your role as research director with Modern Stoicism, or more generally, what sort of things have you learned about Stoicism?
Yeah, well, to go back to 2011, 2012, when we started running Stoic Week, I was a kind of semi-skeptic about Stoicism. And so the first thing that we learned was that most people found it beneficial. But also, I kind of wasn't that surprised that it reduced negative emotions, like anger or sadness. But what we found also was that there was almost equivalent improvement in positive emotions like joy. And later on, and this is the thing that kind of was almost got me falling off my seat, was we looked at the connection between Stoicism and character strengths. So in positive psychology, there's a lot of research into character strengths, not just the kind of main virtues, but they have individual character strengths like optimism and perseverance. And so we did a Stoic Week where we gave people a questionnaire, quite a long questionnaire actually, about character strengths, and then we could compare that with their Stoicism. And so we could find out which character strength was most positively associated with Stoicism. And what we found out, which wasn't so surprising, was that a lot of character strengths were positively associated with being Stoic. In fact, all of them were. That was a finding number one, was that every single character strength they had has a significant positive correlation with Stoicism. But the thing that got me almost falling off my chair was the number one. So, we thought it might be self-control, or it might be fairness, or it might be bravery or persistence. All of those scored highly, but the number one was zest.
Yeah.
Zest, being excited, being enthusiastic, trying to live each day to the fullest. That came out as the character strength most associated with Stoicism as we measured it. And so we thought, okay, well, that might be just one of these weird flukes. But then we also measured which character strength had increased the most after living like a Stoic for a week. And guess what? It was zest again. So people who were Stoic started off being zestful, and then when they were living like a Stoic for a week, they became even more zestful. So that is really interesting, particularly as it is so different from the caricature of a Stoic as being someone that's really dour and passive and, I don't know, a bit more like Eeyore than Tigger.
We don't associate zest with Epictetus or
No.
Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or Cato or any of them really. But is there another word that's used? Because zest is kind of an unusual word in a sense. Is it part of a cluster of traits in that classification, or is there another? How would you, if you were going to paraphrase it and define what's meant by zest in that research context, is there another word or phrase that you think captures the research construct?
Maybe joy.
Joy, right? See, that is a term that's more common. Chara in Greek is a very commonly used word in the Stoic literature. So that there's something that we can directly connect it with in the literature there.
So, you're asking me about the research. So that would be my number one headline. But also we found that Stoicism does seem to be closely connected with reducing anger. As I said, we could do with some more thorough kind of research programs, give them a whole protocol, see what difference it makes. But just the very generic Stoic Week course did seem to reduce anger quite significantly. It improves resilience, which is, as we said, is something that we are very confident that Stoicism can help with. So when we did the month-long Stoic course, that helped significantly with resilience. And also, we found that when people do the month-long course, that it is sticky, and that a few months later, they maintain the benefits.
What length of follow-up did you do?
Well, I think we did a 3-month follow-up to that. We could do with doing some longer-term follow-ups, I think, and that's something that very much like to do in the future.
Done a 6-month follow-up. I think, was it just 3 months?
I'd have to check that.
We'll go back and have a look.
Yeah.
But you also did that correlational study looking at the Liverpool Stoicism scale. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we developed a scale called the SABS, which is measuring people's Stoicism, how we define Stoicism. And then we also took the Liverpool scale, which is this kind of more lowercase Stoicism, stiff upper lip. And so the Liverpool scale has been used in the medical profession. That's what they talk about when they talk about Stoicism. And so that measures things like, whether you cry or not, whether you repress emotions, whether you tell other people that you're sad. And that isn't at all the same as what we understand by Stoicism. Anyway, what we did was we asked people to fill in both questionnaires, the Modern Stoicism, SABS questionnaire, kind of uppercase Stoicism, and this lowercase stiff upper lip Stoicism.
We should say what it stands for. It stands for Stoic Attitudes and Behaviours Scale. And I should address a criticism. So sometimes the kind of cranky philosophy nerds will say, you can't measure Stoicism. But it doesn't matter, because you can measure the extent to which people identify with typical Stoic doctrines and ways of behaving. And so what we can look at is the correlation between how much someone identifies with typical Stoic doctrines and how much they put into practice typical Stoic strategies and other stuff. And for listeners who aren't familiar with research, we should say correlational research, particularly if we're doing it online, is, I guess, in a sense, a simpler and a more robust way of deriving statistical data. So that's also part of the appeal of looking at these two things. All you have to do is get people to fill out 2 questionnaires and compare the results statistically.
Exactly. And that means that in Stoic Week, we could get several thousands of people to do this.
Yeah. So you get quite robust data that way.
You can. And what we found was that there was hardly any association between these two constructs, between Stoicism with an uppercase S and Stoicism with a lowercase s, between real Stoicism, the philosophy, and this kind of stiff upper lip Stoicism.
So wait a minute, Tim. All those people that write newspaper articles and books, like equating Stoic philosophy with lowercase Stoicism or toxic masculinity, which is a very similar idea, and all that kind of stuff. Are you saying they're all wrong?
They're all completely wrong.
They're all completely wrong. Who would have thought it? There's stuff on the internet that's completely wrong about Stoicism, and in newspapers and stuff, and even some academics and kind of well-known are completely wrong about that. Who would have thought it? Sometimes research can be useful in debunking popular myths.
Exactly, and funnily enough as well, we'd obviously found before that this kind of philosophy of Stoicism was really helpful for well-being, but the lowercase Stoicism was I think it was kind of neutral. It was helpful in some ways, but actually also unhelpful in other ways, which was exactly what we'd hypothesized to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's food for thought. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you've been doing with all of this knowledge that you've acquired about Stoicism and how you've been putting it out there and so on. So you've taken everything you've learned from your clinical practice and everything you've learned from all of this research, and you've distilled it into 365 ways to be more Stoic. That's the name of your new book. I wanted to ask you, how is that different from other books on Stoicism?
So I've a bit like we were saying that Stoicism might be therapy for people that don't like therapy. This might be a book on Stoicism for people that don't necessarily like reading. So, because it's distilled into 365 little, some of them are case vignettes, some of them are quizzes, some of them are quotes, that you could read. I'd like to think of people reading it over their morning coffee, or they might choose to binge read it. So that's one, I think, nice feature of it, that you can read it in little small chunks. But also, one of the key things is that we've included over 50 real life Stoic success stories.
Right.
A few of them are drawn from literature, so it's kind of like what the ancient Stoics did. But most of them are modern Stoics, because running Stoic Week, we know that a lot of people benefit from Stoicism. So we just asked people, some kind of well-known Stoic figures, but also people who the readers won't have heard of, who have benefited from Stoicism, and said, "Hey, tell me a situation where you've used Stoicism and you think it's helped you or other people." And so reading some of those stories, I think, provide really memorable Stoic role models of Stoicism in action.
People really benefit from those kind of real-life examples. I tend to include case studies in my books, but they're mainly about people that died around 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
Yours are more recent.
Yeah. And and some of the feedback I've been getting from people is that they seem to really, really like those Stoic success stories.
We know that's how people learn, and in psychotherapy, modeling is important. And we know that people benefit more when they're able to model from people that they can identify with, that they consider to be similar to themselves. So it absolutely, it's logical from a CBT point of view to give loads of case studies and examples of modern day people, like everyday people that have benefited from Stoicism in different walks of life. And also, I can't help but notice that my wife's name is on the cover of your book, because she helped you edit the book as well. What was Kasey's contribution to 365 Ways?
So I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes. So Kasey was brilliant. So Kasey was my editor, and I think this is something that's probably pretty unique about this book. I'm a middle-aged English male. Kasey is a younger American female. So I think it's got those two perspectives. And the way it worked would be, I would write something, it would come back from Kasey, sometimes made rather more relatable, rather breezier than my style. I mean, I thought I could write. I mean, I wrote a self-help book before, and I thought that was okay, pretty understandable. But I think what Kasey's done is helped turn it into something that is really enjoyable to read, and we've tried to make it amusing at times as well. So that, I think, is a really positive thing about the book. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that, as we said, I started off with as learning philosophy and interested in practical philosophy in general. I then went into positive psychology, which is kind of the science of well-being, and then I've worked as a therapist for nearly 30 years now, and as a specialist CBT therapist for the last dozen or so. And so what I've tried to do is to bring all those together, to integrate them. So it is a book about Stoicism, and you'll find a lot of Epictetus, you'll find a lot of Marcus Aurelius, you'll find quite a bit of Seneca, 2 whole chapters drawing on Seneca. But what we've also tried to do is to spot places in the modern research where either they're saying Stoic things, but they're not realizing it, or, which happens quite a lot, or they're adding to the Stoicism, really, by providing some evidence-based ways to help. So, for instance, something that I don't think you can find it in other books on Stoicism is the chapter on each of the virtues. So there's a chapter on self-control, on courage, on wisdom, on justice, as understood in the broad, as you've described it, as including love and kindness and compassion. Chapter on each of those, which has got quite a lot from the ancient Stoics, but also some more contemporary evidence-based ideas, for instance, about how to be more self-controlled, how to be more courageous, which I think will be really helpful for readers.
I think there are 2 main benefits of your book that set it above many of the other books available in Stoicism. And that is, number one, I'm going to say something controversial now. Number one, because I read a lot of these books and articles and so on, many of the books that have appeared over the past 10 years or so about Stoicism are written by people who don't know anything about Stoicism, which seems to me to be a disadvantage.
Yes.
But it's true. There's even a guy who has a YouTube channel about Stoicism who admits that he's never actually read any of the Stoics, which seems crazy to me, but that it's surprising. Whereas Tim spent, as long as I can remember, studying Stoicism, talking to people about Stoicism, doing research on Stoicism. Your background to begin with was in academic philosophy. You'd already studied some group. What had you studied? Plato and Aristotle at university before you got into Stoicism?
Absolutely.
And then also, a lot of these self-help books about Stoicism are written by people who don't know anything about psychology or the psychology of well-being or research and psychotherapy or anything that would be relevant to evidence-based self-help. And so often they contain bad psychological advice or they lack good psychological advice. Whereas Tim he's worked in positive psychology, he's written about it and research and CBT and resilience. So he actually knows the difference between good and bad psychological advice, which is something you'd also think would be a prerequisite for writing a psychological self-help book. So those are the reasons why. Another couple of reasons why I think your book is one that I like to recommend, and also, like you say, because it's written by a man and a woman and a Brit and an American, and you're aiming for this kind of to give people this sense of very diverse perspectives and how many different people can benefit, and to make it more accessible and relatable. Having that combination of two people contributing to it, I think, helps give it that kind of feel. Many books you feel are written very much from the author's perspective. I think your book feels like it's written more for a diverse audience as well. And also because Kasey's involvement, I think there aren't many books where women are involved in writing or editing it. So your book, I think, would be one that I suspect female readers would find more appealing and accessible.
Certainly hope so, yeah.
What's the reception been like so far? What was the audience that you aimed to reach? Who do you think you're reaching, and how have people responded so far? I saw you got a review from Wendy Dryden.
I did. So
that's impressive.
So yeah, so Wendy is. I remember when I was studying psychotherapy, Wendy had already written 100 books or articles on psychotherapy then. So that was really good to hear that he really was recommending the book. So yeah, it's been really positive, and so some people are telling me that they're buying copies for their friends and relatives as stocking fillers, and it's a funny thing to do, really, because are you giving them a message that they need help? But I think because it's a positive book about how to live a better life, that it is a book that you can give to people in that way. But they're also sneaking one for themselves. I had one long time coaching client who I saw the other day, who said, "Well, I've just read the first chapter on the dichotomy of control, and only now do I really get what the dichotomy of control really is." Because funnily enough, when you're actually doing a therapy or counselling session, very often it's kind of more like client-centered. You're not necessarily giving them all the information. So actually reading a book, he said, "Yeah, now I really get this thing that it really is a dichotomy, and I really see the power of it." And that was really, really pleasing.
Yeah.
Had someone else who was kind of a seasoned Stoic who told me, I wasn't sure, to be honest, about it, but before I read it, because I thought it would be just for newbies to Stoicism. But he said, "I can see what you've done. You're starting off with you're putting it in really simple terms to start with, and then it's kind of like a guided discovery onto the more subtle and sophisticated stuff." So, like, the very first entry is deliberately, about sports. And it was Emma Raducanu, and how when she won the US Open, she happened to say something about controlling the controllables. So it's kind of like a cliche, isn't it? Lots of sports people say, "Hey, how did you do so well?" "Well, I just control the controllables." So we start off with that, which is kind of like a cliche almost, a truism, and then moving on to the Serenity Prayer and how that kind of takes it to a slightly different level, and then going on to the specific Stoic take on dichotomy of control, getting into the virtues and the Stoic archer. And so it's really nice to hear that, that some early readers have really got it, which is that, yes, it's going to start off with the basics, but it's going to kind of take you on the journey. And in the last chapter, I kind of reveal the framework that's behind it, which I call the Stoic elevator. The idea being that if you go to the first level, the dichotomy of control, that's going to be helpful. But if you go even further up to some of the more esoteric elements of Stoicism, it's going to be even more useful. But it's your choice. Whatever you take from it, it's probably going to be helpful. But I hope this book will encourage people to embrace Stoicism and become a better version of themselves and be happier.
I think it's a good place to start with the dichotomy of control. Like we were talking earlier about tattoos. Robbie Williams, the pop star, has a tattoo of the Serenity Prayer on him, or at least a kind of joke version of it. And I'm sure other people I've seen have got the tattooed themselves with the Serenity Prayer, which is popularized, we should say, by Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's very similar to the dichotomy of control. I would say the dichotomy of control, hands down, is my favorite dichotomy. Easily. But so the book's doing well. Is there anything else, Tim, that you want to mention or tell our listeners about before we finally wrap things up today?
Well, just to say, I hope that some of them will look at the book, and if they want to contact me, or actually what they could do is subscribe to my newsletter where I'll be announcing. I've got some thoughts about how I might support reading the book, for instance, on my YouTube channel. So what they need to do is to go to my website, www.timlebon.com. There's something that says newsletter. Click on that, subscribe to the newsletter, and they'll hear about all the developments and other stuff I'm doing, which I hope will be of interest.
Awesome. Or as we say here in Montreal, c'est formidable. Thanks to Tim LeBon for joining us, and thank you for listening to Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life. Be sure to share the link with your friends. I'm looking forward to the next time, but for now, it's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson.